the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Jennifer Yee Boyer. She's the Chief People Officer and SVP of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at FiscalNote. Jennifer, how's your day going?
Going great. Thanks, Christina.
I'm so excited to be speaking with you. But before we jump into the meat and potatoes of the conversation, would love if you could share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and if you could also include what has recently brought you joy.
Yeah, absolutely. So my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I would say at this stage of my life, the things that bring me joy, I'm really focusing on the little things. So I am soon to be an empty nester and launching my kids into young adulthood and college life. On the weekends, I like to do anything that does not require me to be in the office. So getting out on a nature trail or spending time. I've got dogs and horses. And so anything that gets me some fresh air, I would say, is on the list of things that bring me joy.
Excellent. I love that as well. We have that in common of just getting out in fresh air and not in front of a screen. I want to ask about your personal journey. What has really led you to be in the people and diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging space?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say my career has really been built fundamentally on helping people realize their potential and then make choices on how to navigate life in a way that helps them really feel like they're seen, like they're heard, and then stay true to what's most important to them. And so I've done that in a lot of different industries and a lot of different walks of life. And I think that as I've grown, one of the things I've learned that while each company I've worked for is unique in its own right, that people really have a lot of the same desires from a human perspective to really learn things and improve themselves. And so the more I can facilitate that learning and encourage that, I think probably the more faith I have in humanity in general.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I think that's important, especially we spend so much of our time at work, having a sense of belonging and feel like you have ownership and there's an opportunity for growth is really important, especially to stay at the company and feel connected. I want to ask a specific question around your work in DEIB and at FiscalNote. A lot of companies have changed their strategies around what it means to be diverse and inclusive and really build that sense of belonging. How has FiscalNote really responded to the anti-racism movement or corporate social justice movement? And how has your DEIB strategy changed really over time?
Well, I would say there's no company that can afford to ignore those things in today's society. So although at FiscalNote, we're a minority founded organization, truthfully, it wasn't until last summer in the wake of the George Floyd tragedy and a lot of the social unrest that was related to some of the systemic racism issues that FiscalNote decided to be more formal in launching our DEIB effort. So one of our co-founders, Gerald Yao, took the step to create a DEI task force and engaged a consultant to support helping assess where the team members were in terms of sentiment, how they were feeling, and then really to start to consider what does that mean for us as an organization? How do we engage folks in safe space dialogues? And then how do we then sort of look to operationalize some of these components? And so that was really the genesis of what led to my becoming part of the organization and my role as sort of this combination of both the people side as well as DEIB. And so what we've really focused on in the wake of all of that is thinking through what is our mission as an organization, and then how does that relate to our mission on DEIB? So at FiscalNote, one of our missions is really to unlock the potential of policy and data to solve the world's biggest problems for our customers, both in terms of the social aspects of that, as well as political and corporate entities. And so on the DEIB side, we want to similarly unlock potential as well, and really focus that on creating an atmosphere where people bring their whole self to work, they feel valued and empowered, but also that they find meaning in their work so that they can really flourish professionally. And so we focus on 3 strategies around that. The first is around operationalizing equity, so it shouldn't be accidental or incidental, and creating community, while at the same time really learning and driving that through leadership with really the caveat that leadership comes from anywhere in the organization. It's not necessarily a title or formal designation. And then really thinking through how we do that with a lot of discussion and open to outcome models. And so since that point in time, we've had over 36 events just this year, 1,270 participant experiences. And so those things all were really part of that anti-racism movement for us.
It sounds like there's a lot of programming happening and a lot of conversations, intentional conversations around operationalizing equity as well. I want to ask, I know the task force is a little bit newer, and all of these programs that you mentioned in terms of metrics are incredible. Is that how you kind of measure the success of your DEI strategy? Are there any kind of KPIs that you're thinking of looking to measure next year to see like all of the progress that has been happening?
Yeah, there's a very lengthy list actually when it comes to metrics. I think some things that are more standard in many organizations, we do also, so things like the engagement surveys. We do track voluntary participation rates in our programming as separate from compliance, because we really want to see, are people truly going because they want to go? And then also looking at the rate at which people are volunteering to participate in these activities. And so I think, one of the things for me fundamentally is that people respond really differently when they're passionate and they care about something. And so we're always looking for opportunities for people where they express a concern or they have an idea to build that into how we're addressing this, so that they really see that they have ownership around some of these things and that they can inform those outcomes. Of course, like many organizations, we also look at the types of applicants that we're attracting and what the flow through rate is in terms of hiring, both from a statistical perspective, but also from the sense of, are we retaining those people as well? We also are doing quite a lot of metrics around compensation. And are we very equitable in our compensation approach, both versus market as well as internal equity, looking both at that by gender as well as other minority characteristics and reportable categories like disability. And so all of those things come into play as we look at our metrics, in addition to just tracking the different quarterly initiatives that we have. And are we actually delivering on the ideas and the things that people are bringing to the table?
Yeah, I think that is really important to see how you're engaging folks. And it sounds like based on the experiences too, a lot of people are leaning in and you're meeting people where they are as well. I think another piece of it, and you and I talked about too, was a topic around driving leadership through accountability, through inclusion and belonging. How have you really thought about keeping this programming real and engaging for leaders as well as team members too, since they're such an important piece to this puzzle?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that we've done that. One is a little bit more formal in that we've actually built in DEIB goals to our incentive programming for all of our incentive eligible leaders. And so there is accountability there. We don't dictate to them what they have to do, but we do create the opportunity for them to have some variety in how they tackle these things and support them throughout the process. On a more, I guess, day-to-day basis, the way we're addressing that is we've shifted from some performance models that were traditional in the past and ways of giving feedback to an inclusive leadership practice. We call that model the 4 A's. It's ask, assist, acknowledge, and appreciate. And these are behaviors that require a leader to engage with their team members, engage with their peers. And so what we do is we ask that they use that as the model to manage performance. And then we actually ask all of our team members at the end of the quarter to sort of fill out a report card of sorts. And that leadership then gets feedback to start to see, okay, am I really engaging with inclusion in mind? Or am I struggling and maybe getting trapped in some ivory tower tactics that are comfortable, but maybe a little less constructive? So we focus a lot on leadership and storytelling, and really making sure, again, that people feel like their voices in the process and that there's a personalization component to this. And so we really recognize one size doesn't fit all, but we want all of you to still be participating.
I think feedback is essential in that conversation, especially with leaders, because if you want to kind of measure effectiveness or accountability, you have to ask the team members that are there as well, and then implement that kind of feedback, whether it's positive, negative, or anything in between, room for improvement. I want to ask too, in this kind of picture of inclusion practices, what role does integration play in successful inclusion practices? What does that really look like in practice after you think about the programming, the training, and all these resources that you're offering as well?
Admittedly, I believe that integration is really fundamentally the most important component for shifting culture in an organization relative to DEIB. And part of the reason for that is because if people think that it's bolted on, it's never going to stick. It will always be seen as optional. So we go with the strategy that it has to be baked in. And so every process, practice, program in our workspace really is focusing on what is that leadership shadow that we're casting for team members, because nothing happens in a vacuum. And so the more that we can start to put it into the routines that team members and their leaders have on a day-to-day basis, the more success that we have with it. But I will say it's an ongoing effort. It's not something that you're ever done with, because the more your organization changes and the profiles of team members and your customers change, the more opportunities we have to really challenge our own assumptions and be thoughtful around how we are coming across to others, and where unconscious bias kind of creeps into some of the things that we may have just accepted over time as a way that we would approach work that today fundamentally just don't make sense anymore.
I think it definitely needs to be a dynamic strategy, not checking the box, especially as you're growing the organization, customer and employee profiles changing, as you were talking about too. And another piece to this, in addition to just talent attraction and making sure that you are, outreaching to different folks from underrepresented communities too, is retention. So I wanted to ask, in terms of your employee retention strategy, what do you think about when you're thinking about the employee's journey at FiscalNote to ensure that they feel like they are included and they want to stay at the company?
I think there's really three things that we primarily focus on. The first is around what I call membership and meaning. And this gets to sort of what are the expectations in the organization around our values and our culture, and then really making sure that each individual understands where they add value. Because one of the most important things I think in terms of that sense of belonging people have is that they understand how they're contributing and they know that it's appreciated. And so for us, that literally starts with our onboarding program and really introducing them to the framework, making sure that there's clarity around those things, and then ensuring over the course of their first 90 days that we're constantly checking in and making sure that they're being attended to. So it's not just the nuts and bolts of the logistics, but really sort of how they're feeling along that journey and connecting them to resources in a very responsive way. We do that not only for our regular new hires, but also as we do mergers and acquisitions and onboard team members from those organizations. And so that would be the first category. The second is around opportunities to express your voice and have choice. Mm-hmm. And so this gets to transparency in our process, inviting people in very explicitly to share their thoughts on different things, to be a part of constructing and designing, rather than just say, hey, this is coming along, we hope you love it. But really saying, what would you like to see? And then checking in to say, okay, how do we do with that? And so just really making it that feedback is a part of how we evolve rather than event has helped tremendously. And then I think the last is really that focus on truth and fairness in how we make decisions in the organization. And whether that's around our compensation model, whether how we do promotions and succession planning, or even how we determine, where folks sit. Those things are all things that we want to make sure that it's very obvious and that people can trust the rationale and make sure that, from their perspective, it makes sense. And so sometimes that means taking off the hat we wear normally and putting our other hat on to say, okay, is this really just making sense because the way I've constructed the story in my head makes sense? Or is it really that the average team member experiencing this will see the same truth and fairness in it that I do?
Yeah, I think of the Brene Brown is the story I'm telling myself, the story that people are listening to and reflecting on that, and really, again, asking for feedback and making sure that you're open to that growth mindset. And speaking of decision making and kind of the why behind things as well, truth behind it, in these conversations, a lot of folks have talked about how HR and teams in general, have really had a very large seat at the table, especially over this last year. And I asked how you've seen kind of your DEIB strategy change over the past year. So I also want to shift and ask in terms of industry stance for people and talent. How have you seen the space change over the past 15 plus years?
Well, I have a hard time admitting that it's been more than 15 years, closer to 25, truth be told. But I would say the shift in this space is significant. And 15 years ago, I was not at all interested in being a chief people officer or heading up an HR function, because my general perception was that compliance and the policing culture was really strong. And the HR side of the equation was often perceived more as an obstacle than a business partner. And so, as I think about the shift and why I'm in the position that I'm in now, a lot of it had to do with the introduction of really seeing this as a strategic imperative, and then being able to leverage data to help drive decisions around equity and fairness, but then also recognizing that personal growth and experiences and this concept around empathy and inclusion are really at the heart of not only helping individuals grow, but also helping the organization grow. And so for me, that's where the attraction was, but the industry hasn't always been that way.
Yeah, I think the stereotypical of what you see in movies or just, what people thought of HR and people is, you're right, not a strategic business partner, but on behalf of the company and just, people, especially employees, were kind of nervous to go to the HR people teams. But again, that is changing. On the flip side, I want to look ahead and ask, what is something that people leaders really need to have in their people strategy looking forward in order to be successful in the future and keep up with this changing world of work that we're seeing?
Yeah. I would say that alignment to business strategy and then really a commitment to investing in your team members as individuals. And sometimes I think we can get stuck in sort of, again, like I said earlier, it's this one size fits all and this belief that people will just adapt. But the reality is people are the organization. And so we have to really, I think, be sensitive and responsive to those needs. In fact, one of the things we're doing within FiscalNote is we're doing a fair amount of inclusive leadership training where we focus on empathy and really breaking it down behaviorally so that it's not just dismissed as something that is sort of a soft skill, but really thinking through what is the behavioral science that underpins this, because that then can help leaders connect with their team members in a way that's meaningful, but then also help connect it to the strategy of the organization to create more purpose and appreciation for each of those people.
Yeah, I think we can't look at empathy and say, okay, we don't have it, so we're not going to work on it. You can look behind the psychology and see, how do we build up that skill and really operationalize that as well to make really impactful decisions and help lead the team too. And again, that personalized experience that you were talking about, a one size fits all approach does not work. In your personal experience at FiscalNote, I'm sure you have many of these, but what is a proudest moment where you were in that moment of flow or all of your hard work came to fruition, and why?
Probably I would say that the moment I'm most proud of is the first ever Day of Understanding that we did in the organization. So we are a CEO action signatory organization, and so the Day of Understanding is one of those events that CEO Action really would like their subscribing members to be a part of. And for an organization like ours that we're pretty nascent in this journey around DEIB, the idea that we would really offer this huge, large scale event and on top of that during COVID, do it virtually was a little bit daunting. And so with probably only about 4 or 5 weeks of planning, we pulled together 7 different sessions over the course of the day on topics, everything ranging from race and gender, intersectionality, mental health, and 75% of our company globally voluntarily participated in sessions on that day.
That's great.
And we had over 25 team members that facilitated discussions, talked about their personal stories as part of panels and facilitated. So to me, that was probably one of the best moments because it just impacted so many people across the organization in such a positive way, where they were able to feel heard and also seen in a way that they felt proud of.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of internal storytelling and bringing in external speakers as well who are subject matter experts, and then putting in the work to do a day of understanding. It sounds like a really rewarding, a rewarding moment to me as well. Is there anything surprising that folks would say, wow, I didn't know that about Jennifer?
Gosh, it sounds like, the game where you do like two truths and a lie.
Yeah.
And so I'm tempted to put some interesting things out there. I think for me, I go back to something you asked earlier in our conversation, something that brings me joy. So for me, I absolutely love the smell of horses. So I
Oh,
guess that might be something you're surprised to know. I find that extremely calming. I like being around animals. And so that's just one of those things that kind of brings me back, that I don't normally talk about it in conversation.
oh, I love that. That is surprising to know, but not as surprising because you prefaced it at the beginning with you enjoy being outside and being in nature and being with animals too, like your dogs as well. Before we close out our conversation this afternoon, do you have any like 1 to 2 key takeaways that you hope folks leave with after they listen to this episode, or anything maybe that I didn't ask that you want to share as well?
I think the one takeaway and suggestion I would make to anyone who's working in the DEIB space is to not feel like you have to have the answers. Don't be afraid to invite feedback and suggestions and try new things. I will say, as a practitioner in this space earlier in my career, I always felt on the spot as if I was the one responsible to make this work for the whole company. And the reality over time that I discovered is it takes everyone. And so the key is really inviting them into the conversation, giving them voice and choice, and then really demonstrating that you're investing in them and others in a way that helps them feel appreciated.
I love that, giving people voice and choice. And I definitely think that's important to recognize that it's not a chief people officer's role or a chief diversity officer's goal, or just like an SVP of DEIB as well, to make sure the organization is inclusive. This is something that, again, what you said earlier, leadership comes from everywhere, equitability comes from everywhere too. And just giving people the resources and the voice and the platform to do so is really important. Jennifer, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And as a reminder, for folks who are listening, AllVoices believes in the empowerment of everyone to speak up at an organization. And we know it's a requirement for the company to be successful. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.